What's up, guys? Welcome back to Picture Breakdown. This is going to be my breakdown of Loki Episode 5, Journey into Mystery. I'm going to be going through this episode shot by shot for interesting visual details, hidden references, as well as any background information that you might need to know. But first, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and notification bell to be notified for every future Loki episode breakdown. Spoiler warning for Loki Episode 5. Alright, so we open with the screen showing the timeline, and again, there's some places that are named, starting with Zimbabwe, then Vormir, the place where Peter Quill found the Power Stone, Oak Island, and then Nova Scotia. We then get a long shot of the void that leads up to the Lokis, and on the left, there's a bus with the name Callum Rose on it, which is a nod to an editor on Loki. Next to Loki are 4 other variants. The first one is Kid Loki, who in the comics is a body that Loki inhabited after being killed. He actually later becomes a part of the Young Avengers, who are building towards because all the young superpowered individuals that Marvel's been introducing. Then there's Boastful Loki, with a hammer like Thor's Mjolnir. We get to see his boastful side when he lies about getting all 6 Infinity Stones. Then there's Alligator Loki, then Classic Loki, who has the same outfit as when Loki first appeared in the comics. Our Loki begins by asking who, what, and where, and Classic Loki responds by saying,
"This is the void, that's Goliath, and we're his lunch."
So there's a good amount to unpack here. So he says that they're in the void. In the comics, the void is less a place and more a being. In it, that it's a destructive entity that bonds with Robert Reynolds, becoming Sentry. The void is a counterforce, and it's a complete embodiment of all of Robert's negative aspects. In the comics, it's actually the void that kills Loki that results in him becoming Kid Loki. Classic Loki also says that the big cloud is Goliath. In the comics, Goliath is the first being in existence to break free from time itself, and has an empire 2 to 3 times bigger than that of Kang the Conqueror, who we're seeing in Ant-Man Quantumania. In the comics, Goliath and Kang have a constant struggle for power, and they interact with each other tons of times. They get walking, and Loki asks what Kid Loki's Nexus event was, and he responds by saying,
"I killed Thor."
Which is very scary because in the comics, it's actually Thor who takes Kid Loki in and is a father figure to him. They then walk past a bomb and a helicopter with a recognizable name on the side of it, Thanos. Oh, I love this reference so much because in the comics, for some reason, they had Thanos ride around in his Thanos copter. Just a goofy thing. Honestly, from the looks of it, it looks like Thanos would have a very tough time fitting inside that thing. They pan down into the dirt and we see a bunch of food plates. Then we see Mjolnir in the dirt. Then right below that, we get my favorite comic book reference to date that Marvel has put in any properties. A frog dressed as Thor in a jar with T365 on it. Alright, so the numbers is a reference to Thor issue 365, the introduction of Throg into the comics. In this issue, it is Loki that turns Thor into a frog. Notice how he doesn't have a hammer with him and that he's jumping towards Mjolnir, presumably that this is his hammer and he's trying to use it to escape. We see a hideout for the Loki variants, and in there we get a good look at an arcade game called Polybius. Polybius, as the legend, was a game in 1981 in Portland, Oregon that was used by the US government to test people's mental and physical strength to recruit people for their army. Another theory is that it was used by the CIA to brainwash people, because it was causing seizures and brain aneurysms. The game, after a little, disappeared, never to be seen again. This is Marvel's fun way of turning that event into an idea that the game was a branch timeline that got pruned, and that's why it was never seen again. In the hideout, they hear Classic Loki's story, and they find out that he lived his whole life the same as our MCU Loki, but that he
Just a projection of myself, so real, even the mad Titan believed it, then hid as inanimate debris.
This is almost the exact same thing to what people around YouTube have theorized about how Loki survived Thanos, and Marvel is pretty much saying that Loki could have survived like that if he had thought of that, but he did die in Infinity War. Loki pitches that he's gonna go kill Goliath, but after they dismiss him, he tries to leave, opening the door to a bunch of Loki variants. On the right, there's one that looks very familiar, because it's one of the Loki variants that Mobius had shown on his hologram. This is the Loki variant L8914. There's also a Loki who's inspired by the Vote Loki comics, in which Loki tries to run for president of the United States. After Sylvie prunes herself, she arrives in the void and touches Goliath, making her see some things. First, we see a ring of rock out in space. Then we zoom in, seeing a large building on this rock, the same building that they end up seeing at the end of the episode once they enchant Goliath. The variant Lokis agree to take him to Eliath, and on their way, the USS Eldridge drops down. This is another thing in history that Marvel is playing as being caused by the TVA pruning it. So, how the story goes, the US government was attempting to create cloaking technology, and they tested it on the USS Eldridge. They successfully made it disappear. This resulted in it reappearing in Virginia and Philadelphia. Some say that the crew went mad, and some even say that the crew's limbs were fused with the ship's metal. They meet up with Sylvie and Mobius. We get a good look at the license plate of Mobius's car, and it says GRNW1D, which is a reference to Mark Gruenwald, who is responsible for the creation of tons of characters that have been appearing on Disney+. We then see a big ship crashed on the ground. This is Ronan the Accuser's ship, the Dark Aster. As they're going to try to enchant Eliath, we get an overhead shot showing the head of a huge statue. This is actually a statue of the head of the Living Tribunal, which pretty much is the most powerful thing in the entire Marvel Comics. There was actually supposed to be a scene in Infinity War, which during the fight on Titan, Doctor Strange knocks Thanos' mind through the multiverse like the Ancient One did to him, but this ended with Thanos being judged by the Living Tribunal. Loki tries to distract Eliath, but when that stops working, classic Loki constructs a complete illusion of all of Asgard, which is a feat of strength that we've never seen any Loki come even close to. But when he gets overwhelmed, we get the tragic death of classic Loki. But remember, Kid Loki and Alligator Loki are still out there somewhere, and I'm betting they'll play into the next episode somehow. Alright, so definitely one of the biggest mysteries of this episode that is put on us is who's in the building and ultimately behind the creation of the TVA. Originally, I was thinking that maybe it could be Miss Minutes, but because of her interaction with Renslayer this episode, I'm less sure about that theory. I'm going to be pitching you two different theories about who could be behind the TVA. The first one is someone that a lot of people have been talking about, Kang the Conqueror. He's a time-traveling villain in the comics who's a future version of Nathaniel Richards, a descendant of Reed Richards. We know that we're getting Kang in Ant-Man Quantumania, played by Jonathan Majors, and we already have the connection between him and Eliath. And in Kang's city of Chronopolis, he has pyramids and a sphinx, similar to what we saw earlier in the episode. I think this would be a very valid option to who could be behind the TVA. But it could also be He Who Remains. In the comics, this guy is the final director of the TVA and the last existing thing in the end of time. He created the Time Twisters, beings that went back in time that ended up destroying existence, but his original goal for them was to send them into the next universal cycle. All things considered, the similarities between his character and the unknown creator of the TVA are just so close it's hard to dismiss these facts. But I think that both characters are worthy candidates for this position. I have a few thoughts on this episode. So on one hand, being a huge Marvel fan, I was super psyched for the out-of-the-blue comic references that the Thanos copter and the frog cameo brought. I actually nerded out so hard when these things happened, and I loved it so much. On the other hand, not too much plot-wise happened in this episode. Like, last episode, there was almost the exact opposite thing because so many things happened. Like the Timekeepers turning out to be fake, Loki and Mobius being pruned, and finding out about the Void. But I think that just because we didn't get as much forwarding the plot, doesn't mean that this episode was not extremely enjoyable. Like the alligator Loki biting off President Loki's hand was just amazing. But let me know down in the comments what you thought of the episode. Before you go, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to be notified for every future Loki episode breakdown. If you know someone who's watching Loki, please consider sharing this with them. Put down any questions or comments, and let me know who you think is behind the creation of the TVA. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next breakdown.